have a 60-day filibuster. For 60 days, Southern Democrats tried to stop this, but Johnson pushed it through. And the main part, no discrimination based upon race, but also sex. And this was put in as a poison pill to stop the bill by Southern Democrats, thinking that no man would ever vote for women being equal. But old Democrats from the North wanted this too, and it passed. Now, as I've told you before, women are not guaranteed equal rights under the United States Constitution to this day. And I know what you're thinking, that's only like 51.5% of the population. What's the big deal? That's me being facetious, by the way. But under the law, they are. But the issue is laws can be changed. We'll get to that in 1 second. And it passed. Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota was incredibly important in this, but the other person that was really important was Mike Mansfield. Mike Mansfield was the new Senate Majority Leader after Johnson left office. He was from Butte. He was the senator from Montana. Back then, Montana had incredibly powerful senators. Senate Majority Leader, and the other senator was a Democrat, another Democrat by the name of Lee Metcalf. And Metcalf was so influential, it's hard to put into terms. If you like wilderness areas, thank Lee Metcalf. And so back then, Montana had really powerful ones. All senators are powerful, but they're nothing compared to the two Montana senators now. Have nothing like the power these senators used to have. So back to this. They passed this. Remember what I told you, laws could be changed. I'm going to get to the other major Civil Rights Act, even though I'll tell you a little bit more about the passing later. The incredibly important Civil Rights Act of 65, or what everyone calls it, the Voting Rights Act. Because this ended Jim Crow laws. I forgot to say that. Remember, that ended, for the most part, Jim Crow laws. But it didn't get the voting. The Voting Rights Act made it much more difficult to not deny people the vote, or to set up legislative districts and make sure that, especially groups that have been discriminated in the past, like African Americans, or in Montana, it was American Indians. For example, they could not be iced out of representation, and made it easier for people to bring up lawsuits saying they're being discriminated against, etc. This is going to dramatically increase voting. Over 90% of African Americans in the South could not vote until this law. And there were virtually no members of Congress that were not white. And that would soon very, very quickly change. But remember I told you laws could be changed? In 2013 and last week, the Voting Rights Act has been thrown out. The Supreme Court has ruled that there is literally in the ruling, they said there's no more racism, and therefore there's no more need for the Voting Rights Act. I should add about half of the members of Congress who are not, or African American, are going to lose their seat in the next election. Because they're immediately setting up the districts to take their seat away. I mean, it's happening right now. So this is a big deal. Yes.
What's the answer?
No, just the Voting Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act, obviously, could be thrown out too. Yeah.
So, what's the big emphasis?
Well, they would argue that since there's no more racism, by helping African Americans vote, it's actually racist against white people. That was the argument. But what it helps is that since over 90% of African Americans vote for the Democratic Party, Republicans all over the South are setting up legislative districts to send more Republicans to Congress. So that's why. And it's very partisan. You can partisanly, you can do anything you want, and that's what's going to happen. We're setting up seats just for Republicans. So that's Martin Luther King getting the pay for the Civil Rights Act. Johnson got all these bills passed by something they called the Johnson treatment. This was where they photograph, but it's a way to say anything, so including lie, but also beg, plead, cajole, and literally get in people's face. Personal space did not matter to Lyndon Johnson. Nobody got more bills passed. Now, after the exam, I'll take some time to tell you some of Johnson's bills. You won't believe Lyndon Johnson. You will not believe the stuff he would do. And there are some stories I can't tell you. I tell you. because they're so crude and or other things. Maybe that'll be my last thing right before I shuffle off into retirement. I'll tell that last year, so maybe another year. But Johnson, and he was known for doing very earthy things. For example, holding up his beagle by the ears and claiming that beagle liked it. He had a massive ego, and you got to be to be a president, and that's part of his story. I'll tell you the name of his dogs and all that kind of stuff. Every kid would get a basket of beagles when they came into the White House. I made that. No, they just happened to show the puppies, and that's him in the Oval Office howling with his dog Snooky. But it just there's so many great Johnson stories, but nobody got more bills passed in American history than Lyndon Johnson. But the problem Johnson has is that war. South Vietnam was going back for the South Vietnamese, and he stuck with it because Kennedy gave him this war. And Johnson was not the type of man who could handle a defeat. So in the election of 1964, he wanted to win on his own right, but he couldn't lose he didn't want to act like he's losing the war. Here's Johnson, his slogan, all the way with LBJ or LBJ for the USA. And his running mate would be Hubert Humphrey, Democrat from Minnesota, instrumental for getting the Voting Rights Act passed, a giant in politics at that time. But Johnson controlled everything. I just thought this was kind of a funny sign. Bumper sticker. He could run on the Great Society, and people liked the Great Society, but the problem was the war. And the war would give an opening for conservative Republicans. They called it the conservative insurgency. Barry Goldwater of Arizona would win. Conservative Republicans have been furious since 1948, and now they got their man. And he would begin what's going to be called the Southern Strategy. And even though he's totally against the New Deal, the big thing he hit was this. He, along with a few other Republicans, voted against the Civil Rights Act. And so he could be anti-civil rights. And that would get the biggest applause. Whenever we would start talking about this, and what they would talk about it's going to be that undeserving people are going to take the rights away from white people. And this one is LBJ's civil rights bill. A white man will lose their job and be replaced by a black worker, implying, well, all sorts of racial implications are on that. A pretty shocking indication of the way they use the Civil Rights Act or the backlash against it. By the way, Goldwater, AUH2O, haha. But his slogan, in your heart, you know he's right. But Democrats immediately turned that to, in your guts, you know he's nuts. Because the big part he cared about was anti-communist. And he talked about, we're at war in South Vietnam. I don't care what anyone said. Nobody wants to hear that. And if we're going to win this war, and what's the only way to win the war? Destroy North Vietnam. That's helping the Viet Cong. He talked casually about turning North Vietnam into a glowing parking lot. Do you understand what glowing parking lot meant? Nuclear weapons. He even talked about lobbing an atomic bomb into his quote, the bathroom of the Kremlin, meaning World War III. Casually talking about that. This might shock you. People didn't want to hear that. But whenever he would talk about the Civil Rights Act or things like the Civil Rights Act and the brand new Women's Rights Act are hurting traditional values, thus culture war issues. People are not knowing their place. He's an interesting man. So all LBJ had to do is prove he's not a lunatic and blow the world up, and he could win a massive victory. Because people liked the Great Society that Goldwater was running against. Overall, even though that backlash against the Civil Rights Act was growing. So, Johnson, though, cannot lose in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government can't collapse. Now, the U.S. isn't fully committed. They're just advisory. Can't lose. And then this happened, the Tonkin Gulf incident. So South Vietnam was sending command of special forces and raiding North Vietnam. And they were being supported by the United States Navy. Why were they doing this? North Vietnam was helping the Viet Cong, and they were literally trying everything, literally just throwing blindfolded, darts at a dartboard, hoping they hit it. They were hitting North Vietnam bases. The United States Navy was secretly, the public did not know this, supporting and even shelling North Vietnam. Not South, where the Civil War was, the North. A massive escalation. And on the 2nd, right after an attack, the North Vietnamese Navy, NVN, they sent torpedo boats out to attack the USS Maddox, an American destroyer. A former teacher in here was actually on the Maddox when this happened. He told me about this. He was in an anti-aircraft gun. He remembers firing its 20mm cannon at these torpedo boats. Okay, they didn't really do any damage. And Johnson was, so this is your chance to act tough, but not blow the world up. Retaliate in a limited way. But Johnson's correctly said, we can't let people know about this. So 2 days later, they sent the Maddox and another ship called the Turner Joy back. 2 days later, without commandos, right up the coast. And this time they reported we're under attack again. So now they could say, no commandos, this was just an unprovoked attack, even though it's clearly provoked. There's torpedoes in the water, attack, 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 we're being attacked, attack. Johnson was told an attack. And so what did he do? He ordered US carriers to launch an airstrike, a retaliation. And they bombed select North Vietnamese bases in retaliation. Before the attack happened, already getting back to the Pentagon, were doubts. Are we really under attack? It was night. How many boats were in the water? Did they really shoot torpedoes at us? We're not sure if we actually were attacked or the crews just freaked out. Johnson was never told those doubts. He ordered the attack, thus beginning the Vietnam War. But we found out later, and Johnson would even say, there was no attack. Everyone got that? There was no second. Johnson's quote was, we're shooting at a bunch of damn flying fish. But he didn't tell people the next week. He didn't tell the doubts. He went to Congress and said, we were attacked and we need to retaliate if possible. And that would lead to, underline this, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It passed unanimously in the House, and all but two liberal Republicans voted against it. And it was a blank check for Johnson to do whatever he wanted. But he didn't do everything he wanted. He didn't widen the war. I can retaliate, but I'm showing restraint. They call this the blank check. But the Tonkin Gulf Resolution would be the justification to escalate the war for the Vietnam War. So he never told the American public or Congress that he lied. So the entire war is going to be built on lies. The U.S. would never have done this in the past, would they? Remember the Maine in the Spanish-American War? Or it's called the Thornton Incident in the Mexican-American War, where they said U.S. soldiers were attacked on U.S. soil when we don't know where they were attacked. That's 2 wars previous, and now a third built on lies. Fortunately, that will never happen again. Until 2001 in Afghanistan and 2003 in Iraq. And we'll see about it. So this set a dangerous precedent, is my point. By the way, a few planes were shot down. And the pilots were held prisoner. Are they prisoners of war? We're attacking North Vietnam and they never attacked the United States. By definition, they're terrorists. This is going to be horrible for the people being POWs because North Vietnam is going to treat them brutally. I mean, not just that, it's horrible. But this is going to set up so many problems down the road. So now LBJ could be the moderate. Now LBJ could be, I didn't blow the world up, but I'm tough on communism. So the Tonkin Gulf Resolution gave them that. That's all the way with LBJ. They're going to run a commercial only one time. They're going to run this ad, but it's the most famous ad that played on everybody's fears. Do you want to see the ad? Okay, here it goes. It's one of the most famous ads in history. I lied. I lied through my teeth. I don't know how you could ever trust me again. You were wanting this, right? You wanted this. Call the daisy. They only showed it one time, but everybody talked about it. How's that cute? So here's Johnson. Wow. We must either love each other or we must die. He played on everybody's fears. It worked so well. Goldwater is a radical who's going to blow the world up. The popular Great Society, and I'm tough on communism, but not insane. Therefore, when the election happened, it will be the biggest popular vote victory in American history to this day. Nobody got more popular votes, a greater percentage of the popular vote than Lyndon Johnson. A huge victory. But you can see the Southern strategy beginning to work. There was no Republican Party still in the South for the most part. And yet they voted for Goldwater for one reason, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson would say, after the Civil Rights Act of 64 was passed, the Democratic Party might have lost the South for the next 3 generations. He'd be wrong. So, this would be the perfect time for Lyndon Johnson to say, victory in South Vietnam and pull out. He just won this big victory. He's got a mandate. And things started blowing up. 2 American bases in South Vietnam were attacked, supporting the South Vietnamese army. Over 100 Americans were killed and wounded. The U.S. is not fully in the war yet, but the Viet Cong attacked them. Things started going bad. And remember the Civil Rights Act? It never dealt with voting. So, the movement, as it was called, organized a march in the most segregated state, Alabama, called the Selma to Montgomery March, to march into Montgomery demanding a Voting Rights Act. And they knew what was going to happen, and it happened. Their segregationist governor, George Wallace, called out the state police, what we call the highway patrol, and they attacked and beat and arrested many of the marchers, all on television. Johnson begged them not to do it. Johnson said, we got the Civil Rights Act passed. Give me time, I just got reelected. And they said, no, we couldn't vote in the election. 90% of African Americans could not vote in the states of the former Confederacy in 1964. We demand the right, and we're going to force you to act. Change doesn't happen unless those in power are made to feel uncomfortable. And so Johnson, who did want this bill to pass, they forced his hand, and now he had to support them. There'll be another march protected by these guys right here, U.S. Marshals. Hard to imagine that happening today. And he asked for this bill. But here's the problem. Vietnam. Okay, if I get my other civil rights bill, get it, what if Vietnam blows up? Then I won't get it. Johnson could not stomach losing a war. He just couldn't imagine. And he kept thinking, grasping anything that could win us the war. Just couldn't stomach losing. So, what if he makes it appear like we're getting tough on Vietnam and might get the Civil Rights Act? That's the march. So, right after Selma to Montgomery, Johnson ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing mission of North Vietnam to make them quit supporting the Viet Cong. Remember, the United States goal, 2 Vietnams. That's actually from 72, but I just like that picture. That's an American F4 fighter plane. Well, there's a problem. What about those bases in South Vietnam? What if Viet Cong lob a few mortars on it? We got to protect them. If we're going to have sustained bombings, we got to protect the bases. Well, what do you need to protect bases? American troops. They didn't trust the South Vietnamese army. So Johnson ordered troops. I don't know why I put Da Nang twice, but I wanted to. Da Nang is right here. It's a base. And these aren't advisors. This is a brigade of Marines. And they're going to protect the base. So they landed on the beaches like they're storming at Iwo Jima, storming the beaches at Iwo Jima in World War II. They were actually met by, think about teenage girls from South Vietnam giving them flowers and candy. It was a surreal beginning to the Vietnam War. But here's the problem. Now we have Marines in the base. The Viet Cong would, in the middle of the night, would lob a few mortar rounds and run away. Are you going to let your soldiers go out and get them? They want to go out. We got to fight back. If we're going to defend the base, we just can't sit there and be targets. So Johnson has a decision. Start fighting back, which means more troops, escalation, or declare victory and pull out. And that Voting Rights Act, he said. He's scared if he pulls out, he won't get the Voting Rights Act. He feels he has to get a victory. So what does he do? Very casually, I mean, really was a casual announcement 2 months later. Oh, I almost forgot something. Right after Da Nang, he went on national television to a joint session of Congress and asked for the Voting Rights Act. Bang, bang, bang. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Johnson, and I believe, and I think and rest at the end of his life, he believed too. He didn't need to do this, but he thought he had to. Here he is asking for this. I just find this really interesting. He even quoted a Negro spiritual and seen a white Southern Democrat do this. Unreal. Johnson was an interesting guy. And yet, this is an attack on the US base right there next to it. So it's all coming together. So then in June 65, he commits ground forces. The justification, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. All this happens at once. It goes hand in hand. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything's related. And Johnson had reasons. The first one, he thought he had to look tough on communism to save the Great Society. Anybody want to guess what's going to happen to the Great Society loss because of the Vietnam? He's going to get over 1,000 bills passed, hoping there'll be problems, but we'll improve them. The Vietnam War will kill the Great Society. It was only the half done. And Johnson's legacy would be that. He was, looking back, completely wrong. The other thing was this. Kennedy made this important. JFK's legacy. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, had just become senator from New York. Robert Kennedy and LBJ hated each other and said, if Vietnam falls, my brother's legacy is destroyed. And Johnson was really worried that Kennedy would jump into the presidential race in 68 and Johnson would be known as the mistake between the Kennedys. And so he thought, I have to go to war. I have to. And the other reason is this, credibility. If we promise we're going to defend Europe and West Berlin, we got to defend South Vietnam. But how do you have credibility if you lied about the reason to go to war? How do you have credibility? Once you lie, do people believe you? Once you exaggerate, do people believe you? Well, there's always a sucker born everywhere, but eventually they'll quit believing you. And this is going to be a problem the United States is going to have. I should add that every advisor, except for one of his key advisors, told Johnson, it'll work. This will work easy. North Vietnam will finally agree, and there'll be 2 Vietnams. They totally misunderestimated the North, but the Army told them, it's going to take us 2.5 years to build up enough men. And he kept that secret from the American public. Everybody add one more thing. He kept secret how long it's going to take. He never told them it'd be a long war. How are we going to get enough soldiers? At first, a lot of young men volunteered. This is mostly men still. Increase the draft. Everyone got that? Gee, I wonder what age group will be the first big anti-war protesters. So it seemed to work at first. Medicare passed. Health insurance for the elderly. Medicaid, health insurance for lower income people, passed. And the Voting Rights Act passed. Here's voting rights. Here's Medicare, given the pen to Harry Truman. And then it began to fall apart. By 66, Johnson was under siege because of this war. How do you fight a war against an experienced guerrilla enemy? An experienced force that avoids large units, goes off into the jungle, or they have elaborate tunnel system, Doug, and then ambush, hit and run. How do you beat them? They can attack anywhere. I forgot, everyone add one thing. I forgot I didn't put this down. As soon as the US starts sending more and more troops, eventually 560,000 US troops would go by 1968. This is the part you have to have. As soon as the US sent troops, North Vietnam started sending troops. Not as many. So now we're going to be fighting North Vietnamese soldiers. They send troops, the US sent troops. All the fighting except for Rolling Thunder is in the South. And millions are going to die. So the US tactic will be called search and destroy. And this is not a new tactic. This has been done before. And the idea was this. We have to send sometimes big, sometimes small units out into the jungle, into the mountains. So here are American forces going off. And there's, they call them a tunnel rack going into the elaborate tunnel system. I can't go into great detail about the war, but what are they hoping happens to them? Remember what I told you, the Viet Cong avoids big units. They avoid big US Army units and attack small units. So what are they hoping is going to happen to them? They get ambushed. That's the plan. What do you think morale is going to be of US forces who their goal, go out and walk into an ambush? Can you imagine how difficult that would be? The majority of soldiers were never really in combat, and those who were never got a break. Hell on earth. Unfortunately, we didn't know any other way. They would try the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Would it work? No. And how do we know we're winning? It'll be a massive battle of attrition. If we kill so many, they literally called it a body count. And they compared it to our forces killed, a kill ratio. The more we kill, the greater the victory. But you can imagine what's going to happen. They're going to exaggerate body counts really quick. How do you get promoted? Bigger body count. And soon it's going to get back to Washington, D.C. that we killed more Viet Cong than there were Viet Cong. Victory! So the whole point was, it's really hard to tell we're winning. But this is what we thought we could do. Not only helicopters, but firepower. We thought wherever there's an ambush, we'll use superior firepower. Heavy artillery and what they call fire support bases. Massive bombing of South Vietnam, including bombers that were designed to bomb the Soviet Union. Now we're dropping conventional bombs on South Vietnam. These are B-52s. And millions of gallons of jelly gasoline called napalm. What's the problem with bombing every place you think the Viet Cong might be? Does a bomb know the difference between a Viet Cong, a North Vietnamese soldier, and a child? Does jelly gasoline know the difference? Remember the Southern strategy? We've had another one way back in the Revolutionary War, where the British Army went from South Carolina up to try to stop the Patriots, and they would go and steal food and burn farms down. And wherever they went, they created more patriots. Every time they bombed, they created more Viet Cong. Every time. Or at least people who didn't want anything to do with the United States and the government. And what napalm did is indescribable. Another one of the most famous pictures of Vietnam was taken in 1972. Now, this is the South Vietnamese Air Force, but using US planes and US napalm, attacking a village. This picture right here. She has third-degree burns over 80% of her body. Her clothes were burnt off or burnt onto her skin. She is in absolute agony. And you can see them crying. And that was an attack by US forces, US control South Vietnamese planes. That can't tell the difference. Can't tell. She survived. She was still alive as in 3 years ago. She somehow made it. I don't know how. But that's what the war is going to lead to. It cannot tell. As if you paid attention to what's going on to this very day, it cannot tell. Bombs just explode. Napalm just burns everything until it runs out of fuel. And the United States used billions of gallons of what's called Agent Orange, a defoliant or herbicide. And they called it Agent Orange because the barrels had orange paint on it. And the thought was, if they put billions of gallons of this over the jungle, the jungle will be destroyed, and therefore the Viet Cong can't hide. Did it work? Absolutely not. They failed miserably, even though they dumped millions of gallons of it. It led to an environmental disaster, but this is incredibly carcinogenic. And hundreds of thousands of American soldiers are going to be hit by this. And many would die of cancer down the road. And the birth defects from this, from women of that age, I won't show you the pictures. They're so horrible, I can't even begin with them. And the effect is still there today. My uncle was drafted in the army. He was an electrician. He was actually on an electric pole the pole had been knocked out by guerrillas, and he got hit full on by Agent Orange. And he died of cancer 18 years ago. So, I know this personally, Uncle Bill, my dad's brother. Anti-war protests picked up right away, even though the majority of the population from 68 was for the war, even though it wasn't popular. And it was a cross-section of society. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of young people, as you can see here, but it's many different types of wealth. It was older people, and mostly people who are generally more liberal, they felt betrayed by Lyndon Johnson because they supported the Great Society. Excuse me. And the draft was the big target because wealthy people could avoid the draft. Everyone got that, wealthy people. So when they started increasing draft numbers, if you had a little bit of wealth, you could use your political connection to get out or join the National Guard, which was a way not to go. They didn't call up the National Guard. So if you had political connections. For example, future President George W. Bush used his dad, who was a congressman, to get into the Texas Air National Guard. So he wasn't drafted. Or if you had a little bit of wealth, you get a friendly doctor to say you had bone spurs or something like that. President Trump got out because of bone spurs. What's a bone spur? Everyone has a bone spur. I have a bone spur. Bone spur right there. But just can't find it. So you get a friendly doctor. But the big one was college. If you could go to college, you're out of the draft in the first 4 years. Everyone hear what I said? Who can afford to go to college? Most people can't. Also, if you got married, so not a marriage, just really quick marriages. But eventually marriage and college would go away, so it soon became kids. So quickly had kids. They would eventually get rid of some of those restrictions, but the draft was really seen as unfair. And as the war became less popular, they had to draft more and more. And that means more. This is what we have to get. Everyone get this down. Working class people. Regardless of color or skin. While wealthier kids could get out. Johnson, this would become a problem for him, the attacks on him. He had a heart attack back in 58. Then in 66, he had gallbladder surgery. To give you an idea how surgery was at that time, he had to get his gallbladder removed. And it was a 12-inch scar. It would now be a little one, but back then, he kept showing it to everybody because that's the way he was, but also to prove it wasn't a heart attack. A cartoonist would take this into one of the most famous cartoons of the war, turn the scar into the map of Vietnam. South Vietnam, a very clever cartoon. But then another phenomenon happened called the Long Hot Summers, and put down 65 to 69. The biggest would be in Watts, which is part of Los Angeles, or Detroit, or Newark. And these were African Americans upset that the Civil Rights Acts did not really change the poverty in big cities, especially when cities were kind of dying at this time, demanding economic justice. And these turned into this mass fits of rage. They called the National Guard, which triggered even more rage, burning down cities, looting, and it was awful. And this is going to lead to a new movement called, I didn't put it down, but Stokely Carmichael, and put down the Black Power movement. Everyone put down Black Power. Oh, I put it. Oh, my head, I got it, didn't put it down. And Black Power was basically DIY, do it yourself. But Stokely Carmichael said, look what happens, white people are always going to be too racist. We're going to have to do it ourselves, economically, politically, which is sad because so many people, many different colors of skin, were the sit-ins or the freedom riders. But now it is different. But one important thing that Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement said, remember I told you how color, going back to slavery and race, the beginnings of racism, color meant something. The darker was more savage and uncivilized. Light was civilized and like good, just. And that was used a way to kind of promote racism. Well, what they said is black is beautiful. And there's nothing wrong with your color of skin. And you should not be embarrassed because you're black and try to act white, which was really common. Thus, you started to wear one that knew allow your hair to grow naturally instead of trying to straighten curly hair. Beginning of Afro, etc. And that's when the term Negro became less used and more black. Black is beautiful. There's nothing wrong with it. It's good. But there's going to be a massive conservative backlash. And this call will go on over and over again. Look what happens when you give them rights. Remember the positive good theory of slavery. And states' rights would be used more and more. And that became part of this Southern strategy. So that Whites Act rights school too. And here, that's fighting against school integration. Here, that's fighting against all the laws in general in Alabama. Race mixing is communism. There's going to be a lot of conservative backlash. And politically, it'll be quite effective for conservatives. And then, of course, Hård Trafiklagen. And we all know what happened here. When Sweden decided to experiment one day in 1968 to say that no traffic law, or we're going to reverse every traffic law. So street lights, red meant go, green meant stop. Drive on the left side of the street, not the right side of the street. And they want to see what would happen. And that's what happened. It is just so funny. And I'm all for it. They just shut down Sweden. That's Stockholm. Okay, that just makes me laugh. Well, in 1968, the Tet Offensive. Lyndon Johnson was saying by 68, even though over 20,000 Americans had died in Vietnam already, we're winning the war. His call was light at the end of the tunnel. Please, we're winning. And remember, 68 is an election year. We're winning. But the North and the Viet Cong decided on a massive surprise attack, attacking every city and base. The Vietnamese New Year was January 31st, and it was an informal truce. So they would use the cover of the troops to infiltrate cities and attack everywhere. And what they hoped to trigger an uprising. Now, this is purely wishful thinking, a little bit like the Bay of Pigs war for the United States. They just assumed the South Vietnamese would join. Hey, the South Vietnamese public didn't actually like the government in Saigon. They didn't trust the Americans, or they didn't trust the Northern government either. They really thought, blow it up and we'll have our revolution. It kind of worked at first. They surprised everywhere. But the South Vietnamese army fought better than they ever had. The United States Army fought well. And so it basically failed. But it didn't feel like it. If we're winning the war, how could they attack every city? If we're winning the war, how could they actually attack and take part of the capital, Saigon, including North or Viet Cong troops called sappers attacked the U.S. embassy, which was like a fort, actually took over the ground floor for a while and had to be rooted out, room by room. Almost all of them had to be killed. He was taken prisoner by US MP and a Marine right there. How could they be winning if they could take part of Saigon and turn that into a battlefield? They took over the next biggest city called Hue, and there'd be 3 weeks of unbelievably bitter fighting to drive them out. And most of them still escaped. It doesn't look like victory. And then this picture came out. An AP photographer caught the police chief of South Vietnam summarily executing a suspected Viet Cong. And this is also an NBC film crew. I'm not going to show you the film. It's horrific. They're kind of casually talking to him. You can't hear it, but he's ordering them to shoot him. They don't. He kind of chuckles. And then this. The AP photographer caught this just at the instant he fired. This doesn't look like victory. This looks like chaos. Most of you have probably seen that picture before. It's one of the most famous pictures in American history. And the impact of this, there was no uprising. No uprising at all. But the public lost faith. Remember credibility? They started calling Johnson, but Johnson had the credibility gap. He's lying all the time. Kind of wish I had that button, even though I'm very sympathetic to Lyndon Johnson. Partially because he has great stories, I can't help it. But public opinion polls went from for the war to against the war overnight. And an anti-war Democrat jumped into the primary. Nobody thought Gene McCarthy would have a chance against Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson runs the Democratic Party, but he actually did really well in the first primary in New Hampshire. And Johnson's like, oh, God. I just won the biggest popular vote victory in history. Now I might lose. And then Johnson's worst nightmare happened. The man he hates more than anybody else in the world, Robert Kennedy, jumped into the race. And Kennedy, who used to be for the war, is now saying peace with honor. I don't know what peace with honor was. He never defined it. But all that matters is, catch the word. And Johnson's like that dirty, rotten, blankety blank, entering the race. Now, the anti-war vote would be split. And so, because people would see him as kind of taking advantage of it, but he had a certain magnetic popularity. Look at the hands, wanted to shake his hands. Interesting how his son now is the head of Health and Human Services right now, and has done a complete 180. And talks about eating raccoons, but that's another story. There were no Secret Service agents for political candidates yet. I'm not kidding about that. So that, for example, one of his guards was Rosie Greer, the starting defensive tackle for the Los Angeles Rams. He was a pretty good defensive tackle with a great singing voice, but not really experienced on protecting presidential candidates. That's what we call foreshadowing. And when that happened after Ted, Lyndon Johnson did the unthinkable. It's still unimaginable. He dropped out of the race. And when he dropped out of this race, that opened the door for not just the Democrats, but the Republicans. Hubert Humphrey, as vice president, is now the front runner for the Democratic nomination. Humphrey was against the war, but couldn't say anything because Johnson. So, right after he dropped out, Martin Luther King was in Memphis, Tennessee. Because of the riots, the long hot summers, King had lost a little credibility. He was in Memphis to support a garbage workers strike. Have you ever seen this picture of them wearing I Am a Man? That is from the garbage workers strike. They were brutally treated as poor men. He was supporting the strike. And after giving what people say one of his greatest speeches on the 3rd, on August 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. The police were there, but not to defend them. They're hoping they could arrest them. That's why they're saying, don't shoot us. The shooter's across the street. You can imagine the fear amongst so many people. This is going to trigger so-called rioting all over the United States. So Stokely Carmichael will make his very famous saying, get your guns, they're going to try to kill us all. We got to defend ourselves. It looked like the country was falling apart. Anybody know the assassin? You gotta say the middle name, James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray. He immediately confessed, and then he said he recanted. He didn't. He might have had some help from other white supremacists. There was a ward. Let me get the last thing. Last thing. I know I got as far as I could. That's a pretty noble effort, right? I promise I'll tell you a few things tonight or to check. All right? Everyone hear me say that? I promise. And then after, here we go. After the California primary, Robert Kennedy, after midnight, announced his victory and was walking back. He was assassinated. There's no Secret Service. My parents were actually watching this. I was asleep. I was asleep at that time. My parents were watching this, and they were kind of turned away, about ready to get to bed because it was so late in Miles City. And all of a sudden they're screaming and they turned into the soldiers. The assassin, if you can't have the three names, you'll have two. Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan Sirhan was mad at Kennedy for supporting of Israel in the 6-Day War. Hey, I got through a lot, right? So a tiny little bit, I'll talk about 5 things I have to make sure you know. Tonight, if you can't be there, you can check it out, but I'm going to give you that information. What are you bringing tomorrow? Very good. Did you go back and look at the plans? So yeah, it's time to go through them. Do you think you're gonna got a couple more? Yeah, that's a thing. The last couple of these.
Yeah. No better out there.
Oh, what did we do last year?
What you got for testing?
Monday I was gone for testing and yesterday I had
You got a what?
tennis match.
So we did a lot of notes. I went over a few things about the test, that kind of stuff too.
Alright.
Ooh. Oh, very good. All right.